You will fail. So what? Everybody does. But your gym, your watch, your yoga pants, they pretend you won't. So when you miss a day, eat the pancakes. Give up on a workout? You failed? Seriously, what the hell? We're Body. We've been a part of that too, but not anymore. At Body, we're rejecting perfection and embracing reality. Not in a Pizza Monday kind of way, in a loving your whole life kind of way. In a, this workout is fun and it's okay if I take a week off kind of way. In an, I'm eating healthy and it's okay if I indulge kind of way. In a, I like myself no matter what kind of way. Yeah, you will fail. We all will. But we're not gonna let that be the end. You see that? We're already making progress. So let's keep going. We are Body. Start your free trial at body.com. That's BODI.com.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of your favorite podcast, New Books in Islamic Studies, which operates online through the New Books Network. I'm your host, SherAli Tareen. For each new episode, we choose an important new book in the broader field of Islamic studies and we chat with its author. Jonathan Brown's Islam and Blackness is a thorough and thoroughly riveting study of the tensions and conceptions of blackness in Muslim intellectual traditions and social histories, pre-modern and modern, in a variety of contexts. At once deeply reflective, philologically majestic, and theoretically productive, Islam and Blackness engages and examines a range of texts from a wide expanse of scholarly genres to show that the question whether Islam is anti-black is immensely complicated and knotty. Unafraid to pose and address difficult and provocative questions on issues of race, class, and difference in Islamic thought, this book not only represents a profound meditation on Islam and blackness, but also a painstakingly researched presentation of the depth and complexity of Muslim scholarly traditions and debates. The ethical perceptiveness of this book competes fiercely with the clarity of its purpose and the clarity of its prose, and the intellectual cum political significance of its argument. Here now is my conversation with Professor Jonathan Brown. Hello, Jack. Thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us on New Books in Islamic Studies, which operates online through the New Books Network. We're discussing your latest and phenomenal book, Islam and Blackness. Um, so I think what we'll do with this book, since it is a mesmerizingly layered book, and it's really an experience I would recommend all listeners to read this book from the beginning to the end. The treasure trove of analysis, information, ethical discussions is just staggering. It's quite an experience. So I thought maybe to begin with, before we get into some aspects of this book, and you talk about this in the book early on, what got you to write this book, could you share with our listeners that story about what something you encountered and that led you to write this book, and how it sort of perhaps builds on but also departs from your last book on Islam and slavery?
SherAli, thank you. I mean, I should thank you for your time, considering you spent God knows how long reading the book, and that's very generous of you. And the older I get, the more I realize that it's not so much that we should expect other people to listen to what we have to say, but that it's really a privilege that somebody will take their time to think about your work and take it seriously. So I really appreciate it. I mean that in a sincere way. Um, yeah. So this book was, I remember. So I wrote that book, Islam and Slavery, or Slavery and Islam, and someone was like, "Oh, you should write a book on race and Islam or something." I was like, "I'm not crazy. I'm not going to do that." And I meant that. I didn't intend to write this book, but in some ways, I think it was like maybe latent. There was some interest left over from the previous book, because there was a story. I actually end I think the last appendix of the Slavery and Islam book on, which is I translate the story of this 8th century Basran saint. Is a Black African saint. We don't know his name. And the last scene in the story is that the saint dies, and his sort of disciples look at him, and the blackness vanishes from his face, and his face looks like the moon. So on the one hand, you have this incredibly moving story where, long story short, the leading scholars of the city basically make themselves, subordinate themselves to this black slave because they realize that he's like the true saint of God in the city, the true friend of God in the city, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this incredible, story about how piety and devotion to God and commitment to truth kind of transcends all, social hierarchies. On the other hand, you have this story where at the end, whatever the case may be, blackness is something that it should be wished away, right? It's sort of like a bad thing that someone who's good, like that, the goodness is sort of revealed by the blackness disappearing. So I was like, that's like a really weird story. That part is really weird, and that kind of lingered with me. But I probably would never have done anything about it. I just would have consigned it to some corner of my mind. But what really made me write this book, well, actually, I didn't even intend to write the book when I did this, but was in the summer of 2020, I think. Yeah, so that was, no. Was that the summer of COVID? COVID was happening then, right? I can't remember.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was summer of 2020, right? So there was this debate on a listserv, academic listserv called Research Africa, which I'm not on. Not that I have anything against it. I just am not. I don't happen to be on it. But I kept getting emails about this. People kept asking me questions about stuff that was happening in this debate, and the debate was about this one scholar named, I think, Moses Achunu from Vanderbilt University, is a historian, and he was arguing what is evidently, I didn't know about this, like an actual academic position, namely that Islam at a scriptural level, right? So Islam at like the level of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet is sort of theologically and ontologically anti-Black. And so people were sending me messages like this, the guy's brought up this hadith and he's using this hadith as evidence, and do you know how to address it? And I kept getting these emails, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. I'll try and look into it. I kind of made some short replies, and I just put them aside and didn't think about it. And then a few months later, I was just, I said to myself, I really should answer these questions more thoroughly. And so I started looking into it. One thing led to another. In order to understand one question, I had to answer another one. In order to answer that, I had to answer another one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And before long, I was working on a much bigger project, and then I just sort of worked obsessively on it until it was a book, and that was how the book came about. So it was really a response to that debate.
One of the key themes that runs throughout the book, but one that you spend especially the first half on extensively, is this disconnect between modern concepts and categories, and also the modern state, and then pre-modern discourses and the context of Muslim imperial sovereignty, from where many of these discourses come from. So concepts like racism, racialization, etc. And you spend a lot of time. I think this book is really helpful for just as an introduction, and perhaps more than an introduction, on some key debates happening in race studies today, or on this category of race. But I wanted you to speak about this key theme that you especially spend a lot of time at the beginning of the book, about how do you reflect on a past using these very modern categories of blackness, race, etc. This problem or conundrum that goes throughout the book, but especially you spend a lot of time in the first half on this conundrum. Could you speak a bit about how you wrestled with this problem of modern categories, pre-modern texts, modern states, pre-modern empires, and so on?
With great difficulty. I guess that's the only way to answer it. I mean, I guess you could divide this book into kind of two parts, or two aspects in one sense. One is a review of existing scholarship on these questions, especially on, there's a chapter I think on, I call it background on race and racism, where I just sort of summarize some of the debates about race and racism, and sort of scholarly debates. And in a lot of ways, that was, in some ways, it's because I when I write books, I like a book to be kind of a one-stop shopping, where you can go and pick this book up, and it won't assume that you know anything. It won't assume you have any background. So it'll take you through everything you need to know in order to discuss a topic or to answer a set of questions. In this case, about Islam and blackness. So I had this chapter on race and racism. Some of the debates like, when does the idea of race emerge? Is it a kind of medieval or a modern concept? Is race real or social construct? This debate. What does it mean to be racism? How do you define when someone's racist? These things. So I think these are kind of, and I kind of give the main schools of thought on this. I'm not, qualified to weigh in any meaningful way, but what you can see in these debates is exactly what you're discussing, which is really how kind of tortuous and agonistic it is for people to ask these questions and try to answer them in a world in which race and racism are so definitive and dominant that it's really hard to be able to talk about the past without imposing your views on it, or sort of the importance of race and racism today on the past. On the other hand, sometimes when people sort of try to push back against that and say that we don't want to impose ourselves on the past, then you end up kind of making the opposite mistake, which is that you ignore elements in the past that are, maybe were continuities into the present on things like race and identity and the role of the body and phenotype and how we judge one another. So it's sort of agonizing, and sometimes, and scholars will point this out, which is that like sometimes these debates go back and forth so much that terms kind of lose their meaning, where you'll say that Aristotle talked about certain people looking a certain way or having a certain character genetically, or kind of in terms of their descent from a community or their nation, and sort of that's like race, and therefore because it's involved in notions of judgment and justification, that it's sort of racism. And then other scholars will be like, look, these, or people will say, well, race is not just about the body, it's just about kind of creation of indelible, inalterable categories in a power dynamic, and therefore, Muslim can be a race, Christian can be a race, right? That it's sort of something that's not really just about your body anymore. And then other people will say, well, if that's what the claim you're making, then why do we talk about race and not just other types of chauvinism or bigotry or something like that, right? So what makes race and racism special? So you see, like these terms get argued about so much that sometimes they almost kind of just evaporate or come apart. And it's not because people are, I don't know. It's not because they're being pedantic or because they're being, super superficial about it. It's more that they care so much, and there's so much at stake that it just drives these debates into like, I don't know how to express it. It just sort of drives them over and over and over again over the same ground, and people are kind of loath to surrender ground because of what they think it means in terms of its implications for modern moral judgments. So it's really hard to do, and it requires a lot of. From a scholar, it requires a lot. From a reader, it requires a lot, right? It requires the scholar and the reader to really be willing to step outside things in their own world that are almost unavoidable, or kind of unsurpassable. So, but and I think at some points in the book, I almost say that about a few issues. I'll say like, if we're going to think about, I think it's maybe the one point in the book where I actually try to say like, is a specific thing anti-Black or not? And I basically say like it really depends kind of how charitable you're willing to be, and how far you're willing to step away from current discussions around this. And I say, like, if you consider this type of statement to be anti-black, then it is anti-black. If you're willing to look past that, then it isn't anti-black. So it's really almost how much the reader is willing to give on some of these topics.
Another key category that you critique in the early part of the book, as you're trying to really destabilize some of the commonplace ways in which the question of slavery is talked about in relation to, Arab slave trade, etc. One key category that perhaps brings this whole discussion together is what you call Arab Islamic slavery. And you show the kind of confluence of discourses ranging from Orientalism to Afrocentrism that have gone into the making of this category, Arab Islamic slavery. And you do a masterful job of critiquing this and really showing that this whole narrative of there being some kind of a opposition between the Arab Muslim slaver and the black African slave, that this kind of a neat narrative of putting these two categories this neatly is very problematic. Um, could you tell us a bit about, what are the different forms of discourses that have gone into the making of this idea of Arab Islamic slavery, and why is this so problematic? This idea of just juxtaposing and neatly separating something called the Arab Muslim slaver and the black African slave.
Yeah. This was a chapter that, I mean, I really, I mean, I say I get it. I got into it. I mean, people get into every chapter of their books, I suppose. But I mean, I really felt like I was uncovering a lot of stuff that I couldn't believe I was, coming across. And you mentioned this notion of Arab Islamic slavery as like problematic, and I think that's a great way to put it. Except that it's not problematic in the sense of we're sitting in a grad student seminar and we want to complicate a text or something. I mean, it's problematic in that it's immensely politically problematic today, right? It's really like you see how this infuses and drives and justifies really important policies in the world today, right? It's like so it's very germane. Of course, people have done very good work on this from a couple of angles already. Probably in terms of just this notion of the Arab Islamic slave trade. Dali Gubara's article on this, and Nathaniel Matthews has written on this. Of course, Ali Mazrui, rahimahullah, the late Ali Mazrui, he really kind of laid the field out, I think, in terms of challenging these ideas. But what I did, I think, in this chapter, which was a contribution, was to look at where what are the streams that feed into the current discourse around the idea that the Muslim / Arab / Islam are these, the Muslim / Arab / Islam is an anti-black slaving thing, right? And that it's a kind of a predatory colonial presence in the quote unquote real black Africa, right? And it's very interesting to see where this comes from. I mean, it's really fascinating because part of it goes back to like the 1500s and the idea of the Barbary slave trade, right? The idea that the Barbary pirates, that British and French and Irish and American and Italian sailors and seafarers are terrified for several centuries, justifiably terrified of being captured by Muslim pirates operating off the coasts of what's today, Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia. But what's interesting about this is it becomes a genre of writing. So you get people who write about their experience in captivity, kind of in places like Algiers, right? British or Irish or Americans. And but then by the time you get to the early 1700s, the power dynamic has really changed, where by that time, because of the kind of power of the Royal Navy and things like that, not now the Barbary pirates have mainly been cowed. And in fact, at that point, until the late 1800s, the real danger is actually to Muslim vessels being captured and enslaved by by European ships. And, they're Muslims from North Africa being taken as captives and slaves to be sold in Italian ports like Naples and Genoa into the late 1800s. So while people are debating abolition and stuff like that in Brazil, there's like Muslims being brought and sold as slaves on the coast of in Italian markets. But what I think what's important in this case is that what starts out as a real fear and a reality kind of morphs into a kind of a genre, a cultural genre, where the writing about your captivity and the fear of the Barbary Muslim Moorish slaver, right? Which always has a couple of things. Like there's a fear of there's the Moor who's sometimes black, sometimes swarthy Arab, and then sometimes the Moorish slaver will have put like a black, they'll say like a Negro slave in charge of the white slave. So like there's this, you can see that as kind of British and American and Europeans are dealing with their own racialization of slavery in the New World, they're kind of projecting some of their anxieties about the fear of rebellion, the fear of being kind of at the mercy of the Black African slave in their stories about Barbary captivity. And a scholar named Paul Bapler wrote some really good things on this, including an article and then a collection of writings he did on this, a collection of edited stories. But what happens is that really kind of takes on a life of its own, and you get these, for centuries, flying off the presses of France and Britain and the United States, stories of Barbary captivity, some of which are completely made up. Like they're especially stories of women being captured. And of course, then you have the anxiety of your woman, the white woman who's being dominated by the kind of black or brown Moor or African Arab Muslim, and all the anxieties you can imagine around that. There's a huge anxiety of men being sodomized by the Moor or the African or the Muslim. And then this continues into, pulp novels in the late 19th century and the 20th century, into board games, and then, of course, into one of the main film genres of early Hollywood, really into kind of the mid 20th century, of the Sheikh movie, of the movie where one of the main genres in Hollywood was the white man or white woman or both getting captured by the kind of Sheikh, the Arab / swarthy person who's both alluring and terrifying. And then, so you have this idea of the Muslim North African as slaver. Then what happens is a sort of parallel track beginning in the early to mid 19th century, as the kind of abolition movement in Britain and the United States is successful in really either limiting, ending, or demonizing the Atlantic slave trade, that they switch to everything. They say everything else in Africa is the Mohammedan slave trade. So this divides slavery in the world basically into the kind of Christian slave trade, which is say was never Christian. It's a misnomer. We've ended it. We're wrong, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's just the Mohammedan slave trade. And so everything in Africa that remains in terms of slavery is just conceptualized as the Mohammedan slave trade, which of course it isn't, right? There's all sorts of non-Muslims in Africa engaging in slavery, including Christians in Ethiopia in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. But that's not neither here nor there, right? But then you have this this idea of the heroic Europeans who are going and saving the black natives, the sort of noble black, childish, dancing natives from the evil Muslim Arab outsiders who are trying to enslave them. And this you see and this I thought was really interesting because I didn't realize this, like the whole Tarzan, Edgar Rice Burroughs novels and movies, and some of the earliest movies that are made, feature films, are Tarzan movies, are actually Tarzan. The reason Tarzan's family is in Africa is to help stop Arabs enslaving black Africans. And then, so there's just this whole this drama of the white Europeans going and saving the black Africans from the evil Arabs who are now enslaving them. Now, then what happens is this gets caught onto by different kind of political and cultural movements in particularly the United States. One is Afrocentrism, which kind of comes out of Black nationalist movements like, what Black nationalism does is in the 19th and 20th century is to it's a sort of way in which diaspora Black communities in, let's say, the Caribbean or North America conceptualize a sense of identity and meaning and hope by locking onto a moment in a kind of real or imagined brilliant African past, right? Whether it's like Ethiopia, or the kind of in the case of Nation of Islam and the Moorish Science Temple, like kind of the Black North African Black Islam, right? African Islam, and kind of seeing that as their place of belonging. And what happens is, so one aspect of this is, while those groups like the Nation of Islam, Moorish Science Temple, for example, will like find meaning in African Islam, another kind of movement that emerges in the early to mid 20th century in the United States kind of takes the exact opposite approach, which is it sees it adopts and identifies with this notion of Islam and Arabs as outsiders who are oppressing Black Africans, and this you see it a little bit with W.E.B. Du Bois sort of alludes to it. You see it a lot more in the writings, maybe crystallizes most in the writings of Chancellor Williams. In 1971, he writes a book called The Destruction of Black Civilization. And then he's a history professor. And then again, John Henrik Clarkson kind of takes over this mantle. And what this Afrocentric idea says is that, first of all, human civilization kind of originates in Africa. They sort of, and you see this in the writings of people like Cheikh Anta Diop, in Francophone writing, the Senegalese polymath whose writing is translated later into English, where the idea that kind of Egypt is not a Mediterranean, sort of ancient Egypt and its brilliance is not a Mediterranean or Semitic or kind of white or Arab or whatever, not kind of a European or Asian expression. It's like an African power, and it's part of an African heritage, which continues to influence Africa for many centuries. Now, while for someone like Diop sees that brilliance continue into things like the Islamic scholarship of Timbuktu and the madrasas of Senegal, right? He sees that as African. This Afrocentric view of people like Chancellor Williams sees Islam as an occupying outside force. So it in some ways Afrocentrism in the United States is allied ideologically with the notion of that idea of kind of the European idea of Islam and Muslims as slavers and as victimizing the wonderful innocent Black Africans. So someone like Chancellor Williams and that Afrocentrist view is an ally of that, because what it says is, yes, like just the Arabs colonized and the Muslims colonized Africa just like the Europeans did. In fact, what they did was even worse, right? And this is where you get the idea that the kind of Arab Islamic slave trade, quote unquote, was worse and more destructive to Africa than the European slave trade. And you can see why this is useful to kind of partisans or people who believe in the moral leadership of the West, if you're European or American, because what this does is it sort of shifts the blame. It creates another antagonist, another kind of evildoer in the shape of the Arab Muslim slaver, and it makes them even more guilty of the crimes of violating Africa. And unlike the Europeans who repented and the Americans who repented for this, allegedly the Muslims have not done this and continue to do it, right? So this kind of Chancellor Williams' Afrocentrism then is also very useful to kind of political conservatives in America and in Europe, because they also get on this idea of we're not, it's not really the West that's guilty of the crime of slavery. Yes, we did it, but we were wrong. And Muslims have done it way worse, and they never apologized. And then what I thought was most shocking, I mean, it's sort of not shocking in the end, but I was surprised to see how clear the links are, was how this whole narrative is then adopted by pro-Israel public diplomacy. So in Israel, and American supporters of Israel, engaging Hasbara. Hasbara is Hebrew for essentially pro-Israel public diplomacy. It's not like a conspiratorial term. I mean, this is used by people who engage in this. They use this term, Hasbara. So you see how through things like funding films, through things like political advocacy, think tanks, pro-Israel groups in the United States and Israel will build on and spin and foment this idea of Arabs are anti-Black, Arabs are slavers in Africa, because it, one, breaks the possibility and prevents third world or global South or kind of colonized people solidarity against. So it prevents Africans and Arabs, right, essentially, from having solidarity, because kind of this narrative says that Arabs are predatory and Muslims are predatory towards Africans. And the second thing is what it says is that it's not the Israelis, it's not Zionism that's racist towards anybody. It's actually Arabs and Muslims who are the real racists, and kind of unrepentant racists. So that's what I thought was really interesting in this chapter. And I mean, one thing that really just it's done to me, this guy Charles Jacobs, who is this very active as American, abolitionist. He started a group called American Anti-Slavery Group in the 1990s, and he would do all this work, fighting slavery in South Sudan during the Sudanese Civil War. This is the same guy who started this group called Camera, I think, Center for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting, which is it's a group that essentially it goes after anybody in the American academy or media who criticizes Israel, right? So it's an incredibly aggressive Zionist organization that aims to basically cow any criticism of Israel in the public sphere in the United States. It did, for example, it funded the movie that about Joseph Massad in Columbia University. And I saw that summer, I think it was summer of 2021, Charles Jacobs gave a presentation, and in it he's talking about his anti-slavery work, but he directly conflates the cause of slavery in the modern world with Islam. He says everywhere in the world that there is slavery, it's done by Muslims, and everywhere in the world slavery, it's Muslims enslaving Black people. Right. So you see like this, the strand, the consistent thread of this person's career is pro-Israel activism, aggressive attacks on anybody who criticizes Israel or Israeli policies, and that's the central thread in his career. But his main activities in the last 3 decades have been abolitionism. But that abolitionism is only focused on in which there's slavery between Arabs/Muslims and Black people. And he uses this to conflate completely the idea of, slavery with Islam and slaves with Black Africans being enslaved by Muslims. So this was really interesting to me.
Terrific. Now, one of the key themes that comes up repeatedly in the book is this idea. We will come to the Quran and Hadith and your discussion of legal traditions and Sufi traditions in a moment. But you constantly talk about this idea of Black not corresponding to a phenotype in Islam and Islamic thought. So hence this idea of anti-blackness is perhaps anachronistic. But you also show in the book early on that there are certain Near Eastern traditions or the influence of Galen and other Greco-Roman traditions because of which there were ideas such as climate influencing, a person's temperament and features, and how that comes through in authoritative sources of Islamic thought, such as Ibn Khaldun's thought, etc. So, can you talk about this tension that you capture early on, before you even come to the Quran and Hadith, about this idea of black not exactly corresponding to a phenotype, but yet these notions of blackness corresponding to certain kinds of human traits still being there in Muslim intellectual discourses?
Yeah, I mean, this is, oh boy, this is complicated. So, and this is, a lot of this is well studied. So I'm not claiming to have, discovered all this, right? This has been discussed by scholars in several fields. One is that the idea that, well, first of all, the idea that people from outside of sub-Saharan Africa, Africa South Sahara, that there's a conception of what people look like, of a certain kind of black phenotype. This goes back a very, very long time. I mean, essentially as early as we have early complex societies like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, we have them depicting people who come from Africa South of Sahara, and their depictions are today, you would look at them and you'd say, oh, this is obviously someone from Africa South of Sahara, right? So you have, and this is true in Greek art, in Roman art, in ancient Egyptian art, Mesopotamian art, et cetera, et cetera. It's true in, Tang and Sung China, in their descriptions of people that they consider to be African, some of whom are African or some of whom are actually from Southeast Asia. They just conflate all this group together, or they kind of consider it one group. But what's really interesting is there's really a very stable image of what a Black African looks like, whether you're in Egypt or in Rome or in China or in Iraq or in Jerusalem, whatever, right? In the kind of ancient to kind of late antique period. Now, I mean, and by the way, there's so many interesting things we could discuss. Like, and I talk about this in my book, which is, for example, why would somebody, person with black ink? I mean, I've never met anybody who actually has black skin, right? I've never actually met anyone who has white skin, right? But so why are ancient Egyptian artists, for example, painting people from Nubia in black ink and people from Syria in essentially ivory, almost white ink, and then painting themselves in red ochre ink? I mean, did they not have other colors? Like, why did somebody decide to call people black or white, red? I mean, these are very weird questions if you think about it. Um, and I don't know if there's actually a real answer for this. I give some theories, but I don't know. So it's amazing how some really huge questions, uh, how some, we don't seem to stop to think about them a lot. And then when we do, we actually can't find an answer because it's impossible for us to answer them, or we don't have the information. But yeah, so what's interesting is that more pertinent to what you asked, is that you have, in the kind of Greco-Roman world, very clear understandings of uh, why people look different. It has to do with climate. It has to do with their humors, right? Kind of Galenic and environmental ideas. And you have this idea that the kind of middle area, the kind of Mediterranean world into the sort of Middle East, is the moderate environment, and therefore that's where you get people with the best features and the best temperaments. And the further you go away from that, either to north or to the south, you get you kind of move into immoderation, and therefore into away from virtue into vice. So you have the idea of the kind of African as hot, emotional, sexual, macrophilic, macrophallic, sorry. You get the idea of the Northern European as drunk, irrational, stupid, big, blonde-haired, always, fighting, right? But you also have, these groups also have their virtues. So the Northern European might be stupid and drunk, but he's also very brave. The African might be kind of emotional and hot, but they're also quick-witted and wise. Now, what happens then is when you combine this kind of Greco-Roman tradition with the biblical tradition, is you get two things. One, you have by really the 500s of the Common Era, whether it's in the Old Testament book of Genesis or in the writings of church fathers like Saint Augustine, or is it or Saint Jerome or Origen, or in the Babylonian Talmud and Palestinian Talmud, you have essentially the idea of known as the curse of Ham idea, the idea that Noah's son Ham dishonored his father, and therefore God cursed Ham's descendants to be slaves to his brethren, and or made them black, and that those descendants inhabit Africa, right? So you get the idea that you kind of take these two ideas, you get the idea of the black African is sort of sexual, appetitive, hot, sinful, boiling in sin, condemned to slavery, condemned to blackness, right? And to serve the more moderate, more perfect Christian, Semitic, European, Mediterranean world, right? And you see this, and Muslims inherit this, by the way, right? So this is all part of the tradition that Muslims inherit. And then the third aspect, and this is, I think, very important in distinguishing, I think, some other traditions from the Islamic tradition, which is in the early Christian tradition, you have a very clear mixing, they blend completely the idea of the black African phenotype and sin. The blackness of skin and blackness of sin are mixed together very quickly, really by the 2nd century, 3rd century of the Common Era, and that will persist in the kind of Western Christian tradition, to the extent that there's a story in the Acts of the Apostles of what's called the baptism of the Ethiopian. So an Ethiopian comes to the apostles, I think it's usually Philip, and he's baptized and sort of immersed in water, and he comes out, in some early texts, sort of luminous and bright. And you could think of that as the kind of luminosity of faith and the brightness of faith, but it's also very clearly phrased in whiteness. And what you see in medieval European art is that he comes out looking not like, a guy from Palestine, but looking like almost cherubic white European. And that idea is really influential in the Western Christian tradition. Now, the Islamic tradition inherits all of this. It inherits the notion of the curse of Ham. It inherits everything we just discussed, with a few exceptions. One is that although the curse of Ham idea is widely parroted and kind of very neatly packaged in the Islamic tradition, and is upheld by many, many, many Muslim scholars. Major Muslim scholars like Ibn al-Jawzi died 1200, like Ibn Khaldun died 1405, 1406, like Suyuti, Jalaluddin Suyuti died 1505, like Allahumma salli salman, other figures, Damashqi in the 1300s. They completely reject the curse of Ham idea. They say this is scripturally inauthentic. This contradicts the hadiths that we consider authoritative on how human beings got their different phenotypes. And also, they say it goes against what we consider to be the scientific understanding of phenotype, which is environmental. So both from like a scriptural kind of Islamic criticism perspective, and also from a kind of pre-modern Near Eastern scientific tradition, they reject the notion of the curse of Ham. But the second thing, which is more specifically what you asked about, which is very, very important and also very subtle, is that Islamic tradition at a scholarly level is generally, and I say generally because there are some exceptions, the Sufi tradition being one of them, the Islamic legal and ethical traditions are very clear in distinguishing blackness as phenotype from blackness as sin. So metaphorical blackness and physical blackness are clearly delineated. A great example of this is in the case of the Quranic phrases that talk, for example, about how on the Day of Judgment, this will be day Yawm tabyaddu wujuh wa taswaddu wujuh, right? So on the Day of Judgment, faces will be whitened and faces will be blackened. And, the faces of the believers will be white and the faces of the unbelievers will be blackened. And, Muslim exegetes are very clear. This is not about look in this world. This is not about being kind of European or Arab looking versus being African looking. This is unrelated to phenotype in this world, absolutely unrelated. And and this is true for Arab scholars and Persian scholars writing, it's true for West African scholars writing in the 1800s and the 1900s and the 20th century when they do discussions of these ayahs, these verses of the Quran. And just another example, which someone sent me the other day, which I did not include in my book, which I found very interesting, is it talks about Bar, who's a scholar from Lisbon, who dies in 1070 of the Common Era. He talks about how when you die, when you're washing a body, the face will oftentimes turn dark, like blacken. And he says this has nothing. This is just about blood pooling in the body. It has nothing to do with sin, right? So there's this, repeated and insistent distinction between metaphorical whiteness and blackness in terms of whiteness as nobility, blackness in terms of ignobility, and whiteness and blackness in our phenotype in this world.
Wonderful. And you've already started to touch on this, but the next theme I wanted to talk about was, which it really is the bulk of the book. In talking about how blackness is represented in the Quran or Hadith traditions, and then you go into Sufi traditions, and then on the legal traditions as well, you make a very concerted effort throughout these discussions to argue and to convince your reader that one ought not to jump to the conclusion that seemingly, anti-black discourses were indeed that anti-black, but instead we should look at the sincerity of these authors, and not just in a very simplistic way contextualize discourse according to its own context, but going much beyond that to really reflect on the question of what did these categories mean to the people of that world, and to really reflect deeply on the sincerity of purpose behind some of these writings that might be seen problematic for modern sensibilities. And I thought that was a very, very interesting and a very important kind of an ethical framing as an author that you presented, that we ought to take seriously the sincerity of these authors from the pre-modern past. So with that said, and there are a number of examples that one can talk about. There is what I would like to do is perhaps have you choose a couple of examples. There is the example of the raisin hadith. You've already talked about the Quran and the question of blackness. There is the whole hadith about the exchange of one slave with two slaves. And then, of course, Rumi's meditations that could be seen as, anti-black, etc. So I will just have you perhaps choose a couple of your own examples, whatever two examples that you want to choose, and talk about this key theme that one should not look at these texts from modern expectations of racism. And if that's the only lens with which we will look at the pre-modern past, we will go awry in terms of our readings. So maybe take a couple of examples and show and tell us a bit about how you make this larger argument about taking seriously these texts, these authors on their own terms, and give them the sincerity of purpose as readers.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start by, I think that, I just don't want to get this guy's, yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, Well, first I would say like we really need to watch out for our own motivations and our own assumptions. And I don't mean that in a kind of, we need to be careful scholars or like, almost, pleading the point or something. I mean that sometimes our suspicions and our desire to cast the past in an evil or kind of racist light, it means that we're just straight up misrepresenting the past. Like we're misreading, we are mischaracterizing people in the past or even in the present, right? So I give a couple of examples of this in the book where, for example, one scholar is talking about how this Mauritanian scholar who's describing his trip in the mid 20th century from Mauritania by car to eventually to Saudi Arabia through essentially the lands of the Sahel. That at one point, this scholar, whose name is Muhammad Habib Shinqiti, who died in 1973, I think, he talks about how he sees this group of Africans near Bamako in Mali, and he says that they're like cattle, they're blacks, they're like cattle, and they don't really wear a lot of clothing, and I've even heard they're cannibals, right? And the author says, like, look at this anti-blackness. And that completely misreads what this person's saying, Shinqiti is saying, because you're not understanding his worldview, right? So when you look at medieval Muslim geographers or early modern Muslim geographers, even let's say scholars of the Sokoto Caliphate in the 18th and 19th centuries in what's now kind of northern Nigeria, they will talk about pagan Africans as naked cannibals. They're like animals. They're closer to animals than humans. The people writing that are Black African. They would see themselves as Black. They would be identified as other people as Black. Other people as Black. They're surrounded by other Black African Muslims. They're not being anti-Black. They're being anti-pagan, right? And that's exactly what Shinqiti is. He's an heir to that tradition. So he does this whole trip through a land of people who other Muslims, we would all racialize as Black, right? And he loves the Muslims he meets. He says, oh, they're wonderful. Oh, I had this great dinner with this. Oh, I had this wonderful discussion with this person. Oh, they hosted me and they're such nice people. All these people are Black Africans, and he has nothing but praise for them. The people he characterizes in the way I mentioned earlier are pagans. And, so not to see the world through his eyes, not to read his text with an understanding of how he saw the world, but only to look at it with our suspicions. I think not only, I think it's actually misrepresents the text. Another example, just briefly, is one scholar who's otherwise did a great study, and I wouldn't criticize this person for their overall work, but they read this one 11th century Christian doctor from Baghdad, a guy named Ibn Butlan, who died in 1066, and his description of different types of slaves. And what Ibn Butlan is talking about is how if you basically take people from different backgrounds, like a Persian and an African, and you kind of have these people interbreed for several generations, you'll no longer have a Persian, you'll no longer have an African, you'll have something else, right? So that where people are from, if you say you have a Persian slave, that really only applies for the first generation until this person intermarries with somebody else, right? In this, somehow this scholar inserts in their translation of this text that Ibn Butlan is talking about purifying the Black slaves' race by having them mate with Persian slaves. But that's not, I mean, it's literally not in the text. It's not there. It's not intimated in the text. It's not literally in the text. So it's just 100% eisegesis, right? Just people inserting their own suspicions into a text. And this happens surprisingly often when scholars today, who I think are kind of laudably concerned with, combating racism and discrimination and things like that, but they're so suspicious of the past and these actors and these figures in the past that they really read things into their words that are definitely not there. Okay, so that's, I think, one important example. Some of the other cases you mentioned, like in the, in, let's say, so it's very interesting. The raisin-headed hadith you mentioned, and this comes up a lot in these kind of discussions about, Islam anti-black or not? And okay, basically the hadith, it's in Sahih Bukhari, it's in the major hadith collections. The Prophet says that you should obey your commander, even if it's a black slave, basically, right? Or it's a mutilated slave. So the idea is, in the context of kind of military, being on military command, but it's understood as meaning kind of civilian government as well. The idea is, if somebody's in charge, you obey them, even if they're lower than you socially. Your notion of who's socially better off and where on the social ladder is immaterial. You obey the person who's in charge, right? Now, one version, which is interesting, it's actually not the most reliable version, and I think there could be a case for kind of dismissing it just in terms of it being a minority version of the hadith. But one version says, obey your commander, even if an African or Ethiopian slave whose head is like a raisin. And this, kind of takes the discussion to another level, because you have this idea of the sort of comparison to food, the idea of raisins looking raisin is like a little fruit. And what are you trying to say about this? I mean, this kind of thing is really see it as sort of objectifying. It's really objectifying and insulting to people today. And I'm not debating that. I'm just saying that's people read this today, and it's very surprising to a lot of people. So what I thought was interesting about this was to look at how it was viewed over time. So what you see is that if you're looking at commentators and scholars looking at this hadith in like the 900s and 1000s and 1100s in Persian lands and Arab speaking lands in Central Asia, they're very, they're just very frank about it. They're like, it's because, a Ethiopian person's skin is dark colored like a raisin, and their hair is really tightly coiled and kind of it's like the texture of like the wrinkly texture of a raisin. Like the texture of the raisin surface is like the texture of their hair. So it's just simply saying, they're an Ethiopian who has the color and the hair texture of a raisin. And they don't really get into it beyond that. It's just saying the Prophet is just describing something through a simile. And then what happens in the 1200s onward, again in kind of the Middle Eastern, Egypt, Syria, Ottoman world, takes on and into South Asia as well, is it takes on a much more pejorative tone. From the time of the 1100s and 1200s, scholars like An-Nawawi, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, other scholars in South Asia, what's the guy, Abu Hassan as-Sindi, who's originally from Sind but dies around 1770. He spends a lot of his life in the Hijaz. They say that raisins their heads are small like raisins because they're stupid. They're kind of demeaned. They're sort of denigrated. They're they're kind of. So you really get like a lot more negativity read into that. And I think that's an important change. But what I wanted to highlight is that the first couple of centuries of scholars looking at this are not really seeing it as, they're just seeing it as a form of description. Whereas really after the 1100s and 1200s, you see very clear anti-Black racist ideas permeating this scholarly discussion. Then what I found was interesting was to try and find African scholars about this hadith. And there you see, what I found was very interesting, is you see figures like Osman Donfodio, died 1817, the founder of the Sokoto Caliphate, his son Muhammad Bello, who died 1837, I think, his successor and a noted scholar in his own right. They will cite this hadith pudding versions with the raisin in it, and they just don't. They're just using it as an example. They'll write to their commanders in the field and say, "Remember, soldiers, obey your commanders, even if he's an Ethiopian slave whose head looks like a raisin." And there's no sense of they're not kind of angsting over this. They're giving no evidence of feeling that they're being objectified or they're objectifying somebody. Similarly, an Ethiopian Muslim scholar who wrote a massive commentary on Sahih Muslim. I think he died in 2019 maybe. Sheikh Muhammad Amin Harari. He's from Ethiopia. He wrote a commentary on Sahih Muslim. He wrote a commentary on Sunan of Ibn Majah. And he has an extensive discussion of this hadith where he brings together earlier Muslim scholars discussing it and also talks about, the place of Ethiopia in the kind of the world of Arabia and the dawn of Islam. But again, you get no sense that he in any way feels that this is demeaning to Ethiopians or to himself. So I think that was very interesting. And it raises the question, which is, I'm not going to tell a reader that this hadith is anti-Black. I'm not going to tell them what their reaction should be or if they should be offended or not offended. But I think it's very important to say that, scholars who were then and are today racialized as Black by others and by their own societies did not find this hadith to be problematic at all. And I think that's very important to keep in mind. Those people's opinion matters. Their opinion is important. Maybe the other example I would give in terms of you mentioned sort of sincerity several times, and I think maybe this is where that idea comes in the most, that you really have to kind of look at what somebody is trying to do with a story and what it means to them. Is the role of this kind of like the story I started with about the Basran saint in the 700s, whose the blackness disappears from his face and he looks like the moon. You see a lot of stories like this. You see a lot of them in collections like Hilyat al-Awliya of Abu Nu'aym al-Isbahani, who died 1038. You see it in the Safwat al-Safwa of Ibn al-Jawzi, died 1200. You see it in other collections as well. And you see it even in the writings of Jalaluddin Rumi, who died 1273, in his Masnavi. And what you see over and over again is the same. There's a Black saint, Black slave, who kind of has an encounter with the Prophet, mystical encounter with the Prophet, or who is possessed of true understanding of God's nature, right? Who is a locus of truth and inspiration in this world. And that when this person has that, or when that truth is recognized, the blackness will disappear from them. But this is very important. It doesn't say it disappears from them and they look like, Brad Pitt, or they look like Max von Sydow, or they look like, a European guy. Their face looks like the moon. And this is really important because you have to think about what the idea of the image of the moon does in the Sufi tradition. First of all, it's associated with the Prophet Muhammad, right? The Prophet Muhammad is like the moon. So they become a prophetic exemplar. They become a kind of someone who is acceded to the path of the Prophet. And similarly, in the kind of cosmological, metaphysical, cosmological cosmology of Sufism, the moon is the lowest level of the heavenly realm, right? Beyond which there is no change, beyond which is truth, beyond which is the divine, right? So the moon is to become like the moon is to transcend the world of corruption, to transcend our world of change, and to enter kind of the realm of truth. And so this language is very important, when we think about it. We can't just look at this story as being, this guy became a saint and then he stopped being Black because blackness is bad. That's just a very crass and simplistic reading of a story which is clearly doing much more.
The next question I want to ask you has to do with perhaps I will bring together two chapters, two very, very profitable, immensely detailed, complex chapters. So it's kind of an unfair question, but in the interest of time, I was wondering if you could compare your discussion of Maliki discourses on custom, and especially on, to be more specific, on kafa'a, or suitability of marriage, with Hanafi legal discussions in South Asia on the question of caste. There is a very interesting comparison that one can make of those two chapters, of those two sort of intellectual traditions that you examined really thoroughly. If we compare the two, what do we learn about this whole? I mean, I guess the whole theme of those two chapters is this tension between the ideal of egalitarianism that you get from the Quran, that all tribes are only there so that people get to know each other, that the most closest in God's eyes is the most pious, and so on. But on the other hand, there are hierarchies, and there is lived realities of hierarchies. There are hierarchies and legal discourses. So that tension between hierarchy and egalitarianism, how could we think about that tension if we compare Maliki law on kafa'a and Hanafi sort of legal discourses on caste in South Asia?
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is yeah, this was for me. I just, I mean, it's obvious I learned a lot from it, but I mean, it was like a really profound exploration for me. I felt like I was answering. I was sort of delving into questions I had a lot had for a long time, and which I found fascinating. So the first part is that the kind of entry point into this is that you have these very specific Maliki fiqh texts. For example, Al-Waghlisiya, which is written by a scholar who dies basically in Libya in 1394, I believe. Mukhtasar al-Akhdari, in the 1500s, from around the same region. And essentially these texts say things like, uh, just for example, it's okay to, you shouldn't look at women you're not related to, because you might be tempted, but it's okay to look at a black woman or an old woman because they're not attractive, right? That's one type of thing. You'll have in Maliki law in North Africa, particularly in places like, from Marrakesh to Fez and into what's today Algeria, you'll have from like the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s opinions by maybe the majority of Maliki jurists that would say things like, if a woman, if you agree to marry a woman, she turns out to be black, is that grounds for annulling the marriage? And then the majority opinion would be, yes, it is. Or is it sufficient grounds to reject a groom that he is black? The majority answer would be yes. And then you have, in the same Maliki school, not only the opinion of Malik, who did not consider blackness to be a defect of any sort, the founder of the school, but in the writings of major Maliki scholars like Al-Qurtubi, died 1273, or Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq, I think he died about 1493, if I'm not mistaken, from North Africa. They'll say, no, what do you mean? The Prophet said Muslims are equal in their blood. And as you mentioned, SherAli, that the Quran says that the most noble in God's eyes is the most pious, and that Arabs have no virtue over non-Arabs except in piety, et cetera, et cetera. Like, we have all this evidence, people. What are you talking about? Like, how can you say these things? The response of that majority Maliki school, which said things like blackness is a defect in marriage, they'll say, yeah, what you're saying is correct. The Prophet did say this. The Quran did say this. But, and this is ironic, right? Because usually when you hear discussions about things like, where people say things like, the Quran needs to be read in its own context, this was dealing with issues of its own time. These are arguments that are made for like, a more quote unquote progressive or liberal reading, right? In this case, the scholars who are kind of saying we need to think of blackness as a defect or a fault, they'll say, yeah, the Prophet said this, the Quran said this, but this was really to break the back of kind of jahiliyyah and pre-Islamic ignorance and arrogance and tribalism, and that worked, and that was for its own time. But now, we have to obey a major maxim of Islamic law, which nobody disputes, which is that defer to custom, right? When you don't have any kind of clear evidence from the scriptural text of the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, or clear indications from the founders of your school, you defer to local custom, right? And in our societies, being black is seen as unattractive in a woman, and for a man, it suggests you have slave origins, and it's considered undesirable. And so you have this idea that, ironically, the thing today which everyone wants to advocate for, which is that Muslims should forget about the Quran and Sunnah and just kind of go with custom, in this case is actually being used to argue for anti-black view, whereas the people who are calling for, scriptural dictates are true regardless of time and place, these are the people who are arguing against racism. Now, what ends up happening, right? It's very interesting because you see how custom gets discussed in the Maliki school, right? So there's a couple of responses to these scholars, this majority that is arguing that we need to respect custom, and part of custom is seeing blackness as unattractive or undesirable. Scholars like Ahmed Zarruq will say, Sheikh Ahmed Zarruq is mostly known as a Sufi, but has also wrote legal commentaries, will say things like, look, you might think that black women are unattractive, but there's also really attractive black women. And you might think older women are unattractive, but there's also really attractive old women. So why don't you just focus on someone's attractiveness and not saying that, this group of people is, as a group, unattractive or not, right? Similarly, other scholars like Al-Adawi in Egypt in the 1700s, a major scholar, legal scholar, will say, okay, yes, we're supposed to defer to custom, but custom changes. And just because you, writing in North Africa in the 1500s, have some weird thing about how you don't find black women attractive, that's not true for other people. Like, they might find them very attractive. So let's not fossilize your specific custom and make it definitive for everybody. Okay, so that's the sort of Maliki approach. And then there was one word, kind of thing, which for me really tied into or made me think about caste in South Asia, which is something that is a scholar whose death date I have not yet been able to find, and I have looked everywhere I possibly could. A scholar named Abdulaziz bin Ali from the Souss Valley in Morocco. And he has the discussion, which I find fascinating. I think he lived probably in the 1800s. What he says is, if somebody comes and tells you that, blackness doesn't matter, the Prophet says everybody's equal, piety is the only important thing, et cetera, okay, you go marry your daughter to a black guy. Your money where your mouth is. And he tells a story. He says, there was a guy who was very respected. He was wealthy. He was the leader of a clan of people. He was pious. Everyone admired him. He was from, it doesn't say whether he used to be a slave or whether his family used to be slaves. But a noble family agreed to marry their daughter to him. And he says that family, that woman's family, was subjected to abuse for years after that. Right? And so what Abdulaziz bin Ali of Souss is asking is, okay, you have these ideals, but what about the social costs? What about social realities? Like, we are Muslim jurists, we're in charge of guiding people, but we also have to deal with social realities. And if we're gonna tell someone to follow ideals, but that ends up costing their family, too dearly in terms of trauma or abuse or something, have we really done the right thing? And here you have this question of, to what extent could pre-modern states or pre-modern legal systems really engineer society? Or to what extent were they just in a position to kind of make changes along the edge, the margins, right? I think that's a really important question. This got me interested in the question of caste amongst Muslims in South Asia, because I was thinking about what's an example of something where it's a kind of omnipresent, weighty social reality that it's very hard to escape, that has mingled with Islamic legal tradition in such a way that you have a significant percentage of Muslim scholars validating this social view, in this case, caste, right? While there's still a minority, or at least a vocal group of people saying this is un-Islamic, yet this social reality is so ubiquitous and has so much power that one has to answer this question of whether or not, even if you fight against it, what is the cost going to be? So that I started to think about and to look into the question of caste in amongst Muslims in South Asia, which I thought was really interesting to me. And you've written actually about this, SherAli, and I think I cite your book in this, about this question of things like widow remarriage, or the remarriage of someone who is a divorcee or a widow in amongst South Asian Muslims, and how even pious Muslims like Shah Ismail al-Shahid, who you write about, who died 1831, that it really took them a long time, and they really had to get pushed before they would do things like acknowledge that it was good for a widow to remarry, right? Where they were able to break away from the kind of domination of South Asian tradition around them and embrace an Islamic ideal. Like, even for someone who was committed to that sort of project overall, on those things that were close to them and close to sort of family and women folk and stuff, it was tough for them to do. So I thought these were really interesting questions. And the reason I kind of wanted to look at this, I'm tempted to say as like a proxy for questions of anti-Blackness, but I don't know if proxy is a good word. It's more kind of maybe an illuminating analogy, or a kind of similar case, is because it's a lot more fleshed out by Muslim scholars in South Asia, and they kind of talk about it in a way that gives it more body than the discussion that I had seen amongst Maliki scholars in Northwest Africa around Blackness. And so what you see is, again, the scholars who essentially validated, let's just, for simplicity's sake, forms of caste discrimination, who validated these and saw these as Islamically legitimate, they did so. I'm just going to say, for the sake of simplicity, if people want to, they can read the book and get more detail on it. But in effect, it's again deference to custom. But deference to custom that they see as prophetically mandated, right? That the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet mandate and validate jurists deferring to custom. Then you have, and that's really the majority position. I mean, for a long, and people who come out against this, whether it's the scholar Al-Bilgrami, who died around 1590, who's talking about widow remarriage, or this guy Mullah Samir ad-Din with his book The Full Moon of the Heedless in Bengal in the 1800s, or figures like Maulana Suleiman al-Nadwi, he died in 1953, or other figures like this in kind of 20th century and 21st century India and Pakistan. It's really only in the kind of modern period, with a kind of revival, of an Islamic revival, that you have people in the Hanafi tradition in South Asia really taking strong stands against kind of deference to caste, and saying things like, Islam ends all this. These are Hindu traditions. We can't accept them, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the people that I found most interesting were not the people who are the sort of staunch defenders of, we respect these caste sort of sensibilities and they're Islamically legitimate, or the people who are saying these are totally Islamically illegitimate. What I was interested in is the people like, to a certain extent, Ashraf Ali Tanvi, I think he died in 1943, from Deoband, or Sheikh Yunus Janpuri, who I think died just a few years ago, 2017. I think he was from Saharanpur, Mazahir Ulum in Saharanpur, if I'm not mistaken. But what I find really interesting about these scholars is they acknowledged that the kind of argumentation for the legitimacy of caste sensibility in amongst Muslims was weak. They acknowledged that. They acknowledged that the most important thing in picking a spouse was that person's piety, right? But at the same time, someone like Yunus Jaunpuri talks about what happens when you have marriage between castes. He says, over and over again, I see these love marriages. People come and it doesn't work out. Your families can't get along, right? Practically speaking, it doesn't make marriage an abode of peace and harmony. Marriage becomes a place of conflict and tension. And so that for me made me think about if you're able to sort of step out of just this language of being racist or not racist, black or anti-black or against anti-blackness, right? That what happens, right, when you have and I talk to imams in America. I don't mention them by name in the book, but I discussed because I didn't want to put them on the spot. But when you have in the U.S. the case, for example, of a Muslim family in Chicago from South Asia, and their daughter marries a Black Muslim from Chicago, and that couple then goes into the imam's office to do marriage counseling, or even more than that, they go into the imam's office to talk about getting married, and that imam talks about the potential problems they're going to have. To what extent are those discussions or are those problems just about racism? And of course, no one would deny that anti-Black racism is extremely widespread in the world and extremely widespread in the Muslim community and extremely widespread in the Muslim community in America, right? So no one's going to debate that. But if we just stop the conversation there, we forget that this is also a marriage between two people from very different backgrounds, and that also has that if that imam is to say, I recommend you to don't get married, or I caution you against this, or I warn you about the problems you're going to face, some of those are legitimate concerns, right? These are two people, just like if you have two white converts or Muslims, right, and one of them is from the Kennedy family, and one of them is from a family who's just learned to read and has never been to college or anything like that, right, and has never had any money. There are also going to be problems between this couple. Like, that's going to be a challenge for them. So I thought, I really wanted to explore the idea of how do you you have on kind of one end of a spectrum social concerns about class expectation, family background, culture, language, and on the other end of the spectrum, you just have pure and simple racism. You sort of imagine these two ends of the spectrum filling in towards one another. At a certain point, you're going to get like a middle, muddy, gray area, and it's very hard to navigate that ground and figure out how one should act and what one's priorities should be.
Terrific. So, as we conclude our conversation, Jack, could you perhaps take a step back and explain or describe for our listeners what is the sort of larger take-home point that you would want readers to take from this book, conceptually, politically, ethically, etc.? Because this really is a book that straddles all these spheres quite seamlessly. What is the one or two major take-home points that you would want readers to go away with after they read this book?
Okay, yeah. I mean, boy, I could talk for like another hour just about this, but I don't want. I don't want to. We probably have stuff to do. I mean, one thing I would say is that what blackness or whiteness or phenotype or color means in history differs tremendously, right? Just for an example, like one of the things I did in this book was try to figure out people who live in Africa south of Sahara and think of themselves as Black or racialized by other people as Black. How do they use the word Black in their language, right? So in a lot of sub-Saharan African languages, The average speaker of their language would point to their skin and say, my skin is black. They would use the word black. And that would be totally neutral. It would not be pejorative at all to say that. But then they might also have a phrase in their language like someone is black-hearted, a negative pejorative metaphor. But there's no link between blackness as a color descriptor and blackness as a metaphor in their language, right? Whereas in English in America today, we have people saying things like, we need to stop things like blacklisting, or we should stop using phrases like blacklist because they're kind of racially inflected. Because for us, race is, and kind of blackness and whiteness and language have become so inextricably bound up together with power and privilege and oppression in our society that it's like a knot that cannot be untangled, right? But that doesn't mean that's true for other people. For other people in other societies, they might actually be able to think about color and description and metaphor on completely different tracks. Similarly, just the last example of this first point I'd make is that oftentimes there's this association, this idea that slavery and Africanness are linked, that when you talk about blackness, you're talking about Africa. But actually, it's probably much more accurate in world history to talk about blackness and slavery being linked without any necessary link to Africa at all. And I'll just give you one example. A medieval Scandinavian poem called the Rigstula, which was written anywhere from the 1000s to the 1300s, right, talks about the origin of different social classes in Scandinavia. The first, noble was blonde-haired and white skinned. The first farmer was like reddish and red-haired, and the first slave was black and black-haired. These people, the slaves in Scandinavian society, were Celtic, they were German, they were other Scandinavians, they were Slavic. None of them looked any different from your average Scandinavian person, and none of them were in any way considered black. Same thing, by the way, with Anglo-Saxon texts from like the 900s and 1000s. They'll talk about the black Welsh. The Welsh look just like everybody else in that area, right? So the idea of blackness and even physical blackness can be imputed to a slave or to a lower other. That has no necessary actual link to how they look or to Africa. This is very important. I think another important point to make, which is we really need to think that other people and other times in the world, the relationship between blackness as a descriptor of color, blackness as metaphor, blackness as linked to slavery, are totally different from our own experience. The second point I would make is that I would just say that that the Islamic tradition is heir to a tradition of anti-black racism, which comes from the Greco-Roman tradition, which comes from the biblical tradition. Muslims adopt that, but that very prominent voices within that tradition, whether it's in law, in geography, in scripture, in commentary, in Sufism, et cetera, very prominent voices throughout the centuries reject this and really push the idea that for Muslims, the only thing that matters, that determines your value, is your faith and your deeds. The last point I would make, and the kind of maybe most like political point I would make, is what to do about it. And it was very interesting because I consider myself kind of a maybe like classical liberal. I think people should be free to make choices unless they're demonstrably harming other people. And if one of the things I talk about in the last chapter of the book is this idea of when can discrimination be legitimate? Like, so if you're dating or you're talking about your romantic life or who you're attracted to, when is your discrimination in your own taste legitimate or not? So if someone says, I'm not attracted to black men or I'm not attracted to black women, is that a racist thing or is that just that person's opinion? And let's say it is a racist thing. How do you change that? How do you change what someone's attracted to? So I discussed this at length and different theories about it. But what I thought was really interesting is as I was doing the research for this, I came across a dissertation written by a black British philosopher named Nathaniel Adams Tobias Coleman. And his dissertation was called The Duty to Miscegenate. And I started to read it, and I really said, I don't agree with this. I'm a liberal. I don't like this idea of kind of the idea that we have some kind of duty to blend. And by the time I finished reading the dissertation, I was really convinced by his arguments. And he's not so crude as to say that we have like a moral obligation to go and, copulate with people of other races. But what he says is that the majority, the kind of white majority of a society like the UK or the United States, we have an obligation to seek the society, and he takes this phrase from John Stuart Mill, seek the society of those racialized as Black, those racialized as the people, those placed at the bottom of our social ladder, right? We have an obligation to seek their society, because only by purposefully and like with a commitment to intermingle with those people and to become familiar with them, that you can undo this racial dynamic, the racial power dynamic of our societies. And then I really thought about the work the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had tried to do in his life, and I don't want to mix up, sort of to equate the Prophet's edicts with like what a modern state would do, because I think in a kind of Halakian sense, the modern state is very is a different species. You can't sort of think about what the Prophet, with his very limited capacities to police and implement rules in a pre-modern state, you can't think of that as sort of analogous to a modern state. But what he tried to do was he arranged marriages for certain prominent people. He said, you noble Arab women are going to marry this Black former slave. You noble Arab woman, are you going to marry this Persian former slave, right? He engineered these marriages with people who he knew could cope with it, in order to show a model for how to proceed as Muslims. So that's kind of where I end the book, is saying that today one of the idols of our world is the idol of whiteness and white phenotype, white standards of beauty, and that we have to smash this idol. We have to. People suffer for this idol. They change their bodies. They hate the way they look. They straighten their hair. They get their eyelids operated on. Right. We need to smash this idol, and the way to do that is to seek out the society of others, and to cross the racial and kind of communal ethnic divides that divide, let's say, the Muslim community in America, South Asian or Arab immigrants on one hand, and African American Muslims on the other. They need to see the people who are powerful and rich and have privilege in that dynamic have to seek out the society of those who don't.
Islam and Blackness by Professor Jonathan Brown, published by One World Press in 2022. Thank you so much, Jack, for the generosity of your time and for your extensive and really brilliant answers to these difficult questions, because it's very hard to summarize these intensely complicated and layered chapters of this book. And thanks so much for writing this book that is bound to spark some excellent conversations, debates in multiple fields, and even outside academia for that matter. And the accessibility of this text really competes fiercely with its complexity. Thank you so much for coming again on New Books Network, and thank you for your time.
SherAli, it is I who thank you, and I'm very honored. Thank you.
So this was my conversation with Professor Jonathan Brown about his wonderful new book, Islam and Blackness. I hope you enjoyed this episode of your favorite podcast, New Books in Islamic Studies, that is NBIS, which operates online through the New Books Network, which is NBN. I hope you will join us next time for another fresh episode of New Books in Islamic Studies. Until then, this is your host, SherAli Tareen, signing off. Take care, stay well, and keep listening to New Books in Islamic Studies.